Let's talk tech priest Skitarii and rather a lot of radiation. We're going to be going through the strongest Admech units in Warhammer 40K right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Adeptus Mechanicus, hopefully making the Omnisire proud with a little bit of data, seeing which units are the most popular strong includes in optimal tournament lists for the faction. Over the past year or so, Admech have had it kind of tough in Warhammer 40k, initially doing very well when their codex dropped, being nerfed rather badly in return, but now it seems the wheel has turned around once more, Games Workshop recognising that they were struggling and handing out some big buffs, a whole bunch of points cuts for the codex, core cataphrons and better objective rules like their improved secondaries. The vast majority of their previous nerfs that they have from the codex are also rolled back, core Ironstriders and the full power Vanguard stratagem are there as well, and it all seems to have culminated in Admech doing a fair bit better. In terms of tournament win rates and things, in Nephilim they were hovering around a fairly dismal 37% for most of that. In Arks of Omen things are looking a bit more up, still probably on the lower end of the 40k spectrum overall. It looks like they're around about 46% depending on which source you go by, but overall they're far more capable of doing well and can strongly challenge the majority of factions in Warhammer 40k when run with a strong army. With so many changes to the Admech Codex, I was kind of interested to see what sort of units are cropping up on the tabletop, and that brings us to this video where we're going to do a bit of analysis. In today's video I thought we'd talk through 10 of the strongest Admech units, and to go for a bit more of a data-driven approach, I looked at 20 high-performing Admech army lists, best coast pairing armies that either went 4-1 or better at a grand tournament, or won 3 games at a smaller tournament like an RTT. These are the players who are doing well and will generally be taking more efficient units than most. Placing highly at tournaments generally means that you have to be a reasonable player and have a reasonable army list, so the selections that turn up the most in these lists are likely to be some of the best that the army has to offer. It is only one way of looking at it of course, but I think it's a fairly helpful one. In the video we'll talk through the top 10 units, how people tend to run them, and what makes them good. Firstly though, I just thought I'd quickly devote a little bit of time to the units that aren't being played quite so much. Down at the bottom of the barrel, I'm afraid Castellan Robots, Pteraxii Skystalkers, the Archaeopters and Call are really being played very rarely indeed. Not really too surprised by those, particularly not Archaeopters given the flyer nerf, and Pteraxii Skystalkers, which needed a bit more of a big improvement given how underwhelming they were previously. A little bit more widely used at those are these ones. Serberys Sulfurhounds seem to be fairly threatening against medium infantry now, a whole bunch of AP-2 strength 4 attacks. They often tend to get fielded in units of 5. The regular servitors are quite good just for sitting around doing actions. Fulgurite Electro Priests are an interesting combat unit, really quite powerful melee, though kind of fragile. People do seem to take more Ruststalkers than them. The core for Catastron Destroyers doesn't seem to have propelled them close enough to the top to be actually used regularly. It does seem that people are still liking their Ironstriders more than these guys for core big guns. The Tech Priest engines here will probably get played more if Skorpius tanks or onagers were taken a bit more. Otherwise though, people seem to say that the other Tech Priests add more besides poor core who's rarely taken. The Skorpius Disintegrator is looking a lot better at 125 points. Again, maybe competing a bit too much with those Ironstriders with the core keyword, but the Ferromite Cannon is seeing a bit of play. And finally, one unit that I was thinking might get a little bit higher up on this list is the Sindonian Dragoon. They went down in cost really quite a lot in Arks of Omen. Fairly tough and fairly dangerous melee. I guess they're probably being heavily competed against by the Ruststalkers for the primary melee damage dealers. Still though, I do think that these guys are really quite good. Finally, before we get into the top selections, these were taken 5 or 6 times. The Onager Dunecrawler, often with a neutron array for a bit of heavy fire support. Corpuscari Electro Priests with all the strength 5 shooting. They seem at least fairly popular out of Deep Strike with that Cartogrammatis Warlord trait. And Cataphron Breachers are seeing a bit of play, but not quite as much as the other troops, I'm afraid. Core Cataphrons are actually making them a bit more of a usable choice once more, but still maybe not super standout enough that people are spamming armies of them or anything. A few rerolls from things like a Tech Priest Dominus don't hurt though. Let's get into the really good stuff though. I wanted to focus on the top 10, but I thought seeing as the Skorpius Dunerider did get selected in 9 out of the 20 lists, I thought it was worth a mention. The Admech Hovercraft Landing Craft type transport is 85 points these days. It spits out a whole bunch of heavy stubber shots, and it's just a fairly fast and reliable way to get a scary unit up and close with the enemy. Nothing really too complex to say about this one. It's usually used to take Ruststalkers to the front as the most popular unit. It can be used for Corpuscari or Fulgurites potentially, and there's enough space for a character or two if it makes sense. Generally people don't tend to go massively heavy on these, it's only ever 1 or 2 in a list in these optimised lists. A slight luxury pick to get a scary unit into the enemy just a little bit more safely. Into the top 10 proper, and in 10th place we've got a joint selection, the Technoarchaeologist with one other unit. The Technoarchaeologist is basically the rebranding of the Daedalus character from Blackstone Fortress. Him and the Engineer are the cheapest tech priest that you can bring, and this guy seems to get the nod over the Engineer for most army lists as basically being a general purpose objective support package. Perhaps its main things are allowing actions a bit easier. You can shoot while you action, which is pretty handy for the big Admech troop units, but it could be pretty handy for things like Cataphrons as well, as he allows them to do infantry style actions like raising banners. He also does his bit of tech priest healing and allows you to get a 12-inch deep strike denial bubble with his Omni Scrambler. That last bit is pretty handy if you've got him parked on an objective and the enemy's got reserves. I think he's particularly nice for being able to bear a Holy Order trait though. He is one of the cheapest options for getting those on the board, and does strike with a little bit of threat when the enemy gets close. The focus blast of the eradication pistol could kill an elite infantry or two. Overall just usually wants to be sitting on objectives alongside some troops choices like Cataphron Breachers or the Skitarii Rangers or Vanguard. Joint on 10th place were the Pteraxii Sterylizors as well. They were also taken by 10 out of the 20 top lists. They're 19 points per model, mechanical birdsmen with flamer phosphor torches, perhaps a little bit harder to kill than some with 2 wounds and the 5+ bionics. These guys can clear out light infantry fairly well with those boosted flamers, plus their Pteraxii talons with the AP-1 in melee. And they do have a few other interesting options, such as being able to jump around the board with one stratagem, and also prevent enemy fallback if that matters. It seems that these guys are most commonly taken as a small unit of 5. I think they're probably jumping around to do secondary objectives, like behind enemy lines perhaps. Could be handy enough for actions though, or just screen clearing if that makes more sense. Definitely a unit with some options. In 9th place, we've got the slightly iconic Tech Priest Dominus. He's 70 points, and you really get quite an impressive stat line for that cost, I think. Fairly tough for a character at 5 wounds, toughness 4 and a 2+ save, and has at least a little bit of threat in terms of close range shooting and melee. His main thing is giving you a reroll 1s to hit bubble. Pretty nice for just about anything core to be honest, whether it's Balistarii, Cataphrons, Rangers or Vanguard, as well as also being quite a nice place to put Holy Order traits and doing his bit of repairing as he is a tech priest. He's perhaps a bit more suited to be on the front line than the Technoarchaeologist with his better defense. Can be a nice one for things like the raiment of the Technomartyr, and the Tech Priests have quite a nice stratagem to allow enemy to fight last as well if they get in combat. Can be pretty handy alongside some combat units. Overall I think he brings quite a bit to the table just for 70 points in himself, and those Holy Orders give you all manner of different helpful things. In a similar vein, and taken around the same amount, is the Tech Priest Manipulus. The Dominus was taken in 11 lists, the Manipulus in 12, plenty of lists had both, and just about every army had a Tech Priest of some description, whether or not it was one of these guys or the Technoarchaeologist. I'd say in terms of what you get for the points, the Manipulus is pretty similar to the Dominus to be honest. Some interesting close range shooting, reasonable durability, and some repairs. His thing though is some big synergy with the Rangers and Vanguard, that galvanic field manipulation giving them an extra AP-1 and a bit more range. Those buffs are absolutely massive for one of those units, and spamming out a unit of 20 of either Rangers or Vanguard is a very viable damage dealer for the Admech army. Lots of lists had a block of either one of those. AP-1 on Vanguard is perhaps particularly big now Armour of Contempt isn't a thing anymore. They can hand out a crazy bucket of auto wounds, and if all of those auto wounds are at AP-1, that's fairly scary stuff. Otherwise can be a good place for those Holy Orders once more. The raiment of the Technomartyr gives you an extra bit of defense with a 5+ feel no pain, plus a nearby unit can move and fire without any hit roll or ballistic skill modifiers, and can be pretty handy for both Rangers and Vanguard, the Rangers when moving, the Vanguard when advancing. I think I saw most people use the Magna Rail Lance for the single big damage 3 shot, though a fair few pick up the Transonic Cannon, particularly things like Lucius lists, to having them teleport around with the Solar Flare. Moving up in the world, we've then got 3 different units that are all tied for 5th place. Really quite a lot of agreement as to what's good in these Admech lists. All of these and the above ones have been taken in over 80% of armies. First up we've got the Skitarii Rangers, 9 points per model, and now getting their improved bionics with the 5+ invul, plus getting a bit more free gear in Arks of Omen as well. The Rangers are pretty great mainline damage dealers, 9 points per model, and they spit out 2 shots with their galvanic rifle, heavy 2 at 30 inches with strength 4 and AP-1, and as mentioned they do work very well with that Manipulus, Extra range and AP-2 on those shots is pretty terrifying. People tend to field them in one of either two ways, just small squads for objective securing, moving on to things, and then chipping in with a little bit of quality fire against the enemy army at range, or the big investment one with things like the Tech Priest Manipulus and stratagems and things. Take a big squad of 20, take a data tether and Omnispecs, strongly consider things like the Wrath of Mars stratagem if you're playing Mars, or the Galvanic Volley Fire stratagem for yet more shots, and then make use of all of the great HQ, Warlord trait, relics and Holy Order buffs that you can get, things like rerolls from a Skitarii Marshal, or multiple layered Skitarii Warlord traits that you can often broadcast to these guys, things like ignoring cover or gaining cover themselves. There's a couple of decent ways to allow them to fall back and shoot, such as a Holy Order and one of the Skitarii Warlord traits as well, so you've got some good insurance against them being locked up. For the bigger units, the special weapons seem usable but not auto-include. Sometimes it might just be better to get the most out of the Manipulus buffs, plus Galvanic Volley Fire if you're using it and you're buffing out a full unit. Overall very solid though. It still seems that Rangers and Vanguard seem to be the preferred troops choices for the army. Those 5+ invul saves were a big deal. Finally, also joined on 5th place are the Sicarian Infiltrators. These guys are 17 points per model and basically the 4 deployment Skitarii killers. These assassin constructs move 8 inches, have 2 wounds and a bunch of attacks, and a few useful stratagems including a redeployment one, and their nearby ability to turn off rerolls and debuff leadership. These guys are generally just taken for a bit of a premium choice unit for forward deployments, usually in 1 or 2 units of 5, set them up on midfield objectives to get to work on them early and threaten enemy infantry trying to take them. They will be pretty efficient against clearing hordes and screens with either flechette blasters or stub carbines, both of which seem pretty usable alongside their melee gear. Probably not units to go absolutely mad on with spamming them or anything, but 1 or 2 squads to help with board control in the early game does seem like it's a very popular choice. Finally, joint on 5th place, we also have the Ironstrider Balistarii as well. Again, taken by 4 out of every 5 lists, the gun-toting chicken walkers are very popular indeed, and basically have been ever since the Codex came out, having multiple good things going for them, being very fast, having the core keyword for great buffs, and having some of the more efficient firepower in the Codex as well, fairly easily rivaling the heavier Skitarii vehicles on raw numbers. Despite Games Workshop tweaking some points for the heavier vehicles like the Onagers and the Skorpius tanks, it still does seem like the Ironstriders are winning out overall on the vehicle shooting game. Both the speed and the core keyword are really big deals there, and they've even got a very helpful stratagem to max their advance move and also still fire with no penalty. If you desperately need line of sight on something, then that can often be a make or break. I feel like these guys are a unit that you can either field in very small squads or very big squads, and it's all fine. Quite a lot of people do seem to like running really quite big units of these guys though, something like 3 to 5 of them. It does really help out with that eradication of flesh secondary, where it gets harder if you lose entire vehicle units, but just losing one Ironstrider out of a squadron doesn't count. Makes it very easy if they can kill something but not have the entire squad wiped in return. Finally, for the guns, the las cannons seem to be far more popular than the autocannons at the moment. I guess in terms of more mid-strength firepower, you can get a lot of that from the Rangers and the Vanguard perhaps. Having a bit of truly dedicated anti-heavy fire support is pretty nice, and the Cognate las cannons with the D3+3 damage do seem to fit that bill. Still a very popular unit, it does seem that most top lists still run them, and often in really quite good numbers. Next up, and perhaps pushing into even more auto-include territory, we have the Serberys Raiders. These guys are the pre-game moving dog horse cavalry with the sniper rifles. They're 18 points per model, move quite fast, and genuinely have quite a reasonable damage output for cheap skirmishers, 2 shots with the rifle, plus a little bit of melee with cavalry saber and clawed attacks from the dog horse Cerberus. For the most part, people usually tend to run these as a couple of small minimum sized units just for a bit of board control in the early game, and between these and some Sicarian Infiltrators, they do tend to do that job pretty reliably. The Infiltrators can actually have a bit of synergy with these guys. The Cerberus could be screened by enemy forward deploy units, so having some Infiltrators to set up in the midfield would allow them to get their pre-game move as they'd intend. Just having them as an annoying threat to remove on objectives, maybe trying to hide out of line of sight, is pretty helpful in itself, but they can do some decent damage to enemy light infantry, and potentially even go for some surprise damage on characters with those AP-1 snipers. A good roll could actually be surprisingly lethal to smaller support characters, maybe something with a 4+ save and toughness 3. Getting into very auto-include territory now, these last 3 units were all taken in 90% of lists. In second place we've got a tie again. First up, the Skitarii Marshal with 18 selections out of 20. It does seem to be the way in the moment that the Admech HQ section, you take at least some tech priests, but then you have this guy as well. Most of the efficient core damage dealers in the army do tend to be the Skitarii ones. Rangers, Vanguard, Ruststalkers, and Ironstriders are all massively popular, and this guy can give them some big buffs. First up, he gets his standard rerolls to wound, and then he's got an almost auto-include relic for a reroll ones to hit aura. So for just a 50-point model and 1 command point, you can have reroll ones to hit and wound, very impressive damage boost there. He's also very useful for turning off the negative for one of the Doctriners as well. Say for example, if you were in the Bulwark Doctriner and you needed some extra movement on the Ruststalkers, he'd helpfully mitigate that disadvantage, and the same for say combat units if you're getting the army-wide +1 to hit. He's also a particularly interesting choice due to the Skitarii Warlord traits that you can put on him, various useful buffs that you can broadcast around the battlefield to data tether units if you need to. The fall back and shoot one is really handy, as is gaining light cover, and potentially ignoring penalties for things like heavy weapons moving with the Battlesphere uplink one. He's certainly not going to be doing much in combat himself, but he doesn't really need to at 50 points, he's just a spectacularly efficient buffing character. Joint with him though, and also in the vast majority of these lists analysed, here we have the Skitarii Vanguard. Again, very grateful to have the recipient of the buffs from Arks of Omen. A 5+ invul save is going to keep these guys alive a fair bit longer, and they perhaps particularly like the free war gear that you get on the Sergeant. They quite enjoy their power swords with enemies with -1 toughness. Vanguard are 9 points for strength and toughness 3 infantry with a 4+ save. They're really quite a potent unit though. They strike with the radium carbine with 3 shots at 18 inches, only strength 3 but a decent amount of volume fire, plus you auto wound anything that isn't a vehicle on a hit roll of a 6. It's really not dreadful at killing infantry or things like tough monsters or enemy demons or something, but it's perhaps particularly nice with the Manipulus' buff with the extra range and AP -1, that turns it into something that's really quite general purpose for anything that isn't vehicles. Big squads of them are great with the data tether and the Omnispecs for some ignores cover. And I think a lot of lists deliberately include a big 20-man Vanguard squad just to use that enriched round stratagem on. 1 command point gets all of those radium carbines auto-wounding on a 4+ to hit, which is pretty mental when you can be spitting out 60 shots out of a unit. On average, that gets you 30 wounds on the enemy, maybe at AP -1 with a Manipulus, and potentially more if you've got rerolls. Pretty much anything non-vehicle in the game that doesn't have an obscenely high save is going to be pretty threatened by that. Otherwise though, these are really quite popular just in small 5-man units running around the board getting objectives. Compared with the Rangers, they can be fairly happy about moving extra fast and advancing each turn. You can still get a decent amount of damage output out of them while they do that. And in terms of units scrapping over objectives, that rad saturation debuff they get is actually pretty vicious. Enemy units within engagement range get -1 strength and toughness. It really does actually make these guys fairly hard to take out for toughness 3 units, say in combat. I've seen a fair few lists using plasma calivers on these small units as well. They're really quite a strong upgrade for a couple of plasma shots for just literally 5 points. They're perhaps particularly popular in Mars with a single hit reroll per unit. Overall, seems that just about every Admech list can find a role for some Skitarii Vanguard, whether or not it's a big damage dealing block of 20 or multiple 5-man units running all over the board taking objectives. Finally, last but not least, we have the Sword of the Omnissiah in the Sicarian Ruststalkers. 16 points per model, and they do claim the title as the most played unit out of any of these armies, all but one list decided to run at least some. It seems that these guys really haven't lost any popularity since Nephilim. They do seem to remain as one of the go-to damage dealers for the army, really quite fast movement with 8 inches, okay durability with a couple of wounds and their extra +1 to their saves in cover rule, which makes them hard to kill when they have light cover, and then when they hit home they've got some very general purpose combat, strength 5 attacks at AP -3 with their blades, 3 attacks per model, and 6s to wound deal a mortal wound as well, which means they can punch up against really hard stuff pretty good. They've also got very easy support stratagems for +1 strength or +1 attack if the target's going to be big enough to need it. Quite nice to have the extra damage on tap if you just need that slight edge. And the squad can be quite a nice one to put a couple of the Skitarii relics in, either the Tempocopia to make enemy units fight last, or the Omniscient Mask for yet more melee damage that gives the unit exploding 6s to hit. The majority of armies do seem to run these in good numbers, often at least 2 biggish units, maybe in squad sizes of around 8 to 10 perhaps, often making use of Dune Riders, but not always. They can be a good focal target for certain character buffs. Some of the holy orders can be quite good, and they will of course be extra potent in Riser as well, where they get the +1 to wounds. Overall, they're still looking like one of the premier damage dealers of the codex, and is it good enough for a lot of lists to want to pick them up, maybe sharing the elite slots with some infiltrators. So anyway, there we have it, a bit of a tour through some of the strongest Adeptus Mechanicus units in Warhammer 40k right now. I look forward to hearing what sort of units you've been using and why, and any other tips or tricks for using the units that we've talked about. There are quite a lot of options in the Admech codex, it is rather deep. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I'll try and make a fair few more of these type videos for other factions. If you'd like to check out my one for Necrons, I'll leave that linked in the video description. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description as well. The channel's Patreon page is what allows me to spend the time to make quite so many videos like this, so if you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.